Once was a swagman camped by a billabong, under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Lukes at the Crossroads. I'd like to welcome our guests, panellists today. Betty Lukes from Adelaide. Welcome, Betty.
Thank you, Arnie. Good morning.
And Wally Klinck from Canada. Welcome, Wally.
Greetings from Canada.
Good on you. All right. So we've been talking Lecture 5 in the Social Credit series, and we talk about money creation in the modern economy. But there's also so much more to Douglas Social Credit, the policy of freedom. And that's why you need to do the entire course in order to even begin to understand what this man was about and how essentially he called it the policy of a philosophy, and that philosophy is Christianity. That philosophy of freedom is Christianity, where the inherent belief that within the individual is a touch of divinity and that no man has a right to impose their will over another. And so we've got to respect that. And I think that's most important, this policy of freedom. This is what it's about. And so I'd like to, give the floor to Betty. Betty.
Thank you, Arnie. Well, it seems to me that while the subject is about money and banking and credit creation, what we have to understand is that is a system, and it's a system that's imposed upon us, and it is directing the direction our lives take, and it has no right to. But it's not enough to just understand the money system. You have to look at all of life, and and think about just the potential that there is for life. And over the weekend, I went back through some of my books on the money question, and one in particular, of course, was the Babylonian Woe. And that's a term, of course, that comes from the New Testament. I think it's in the book of Revelation. It talks about Babylon. And who was Babylon? Babylon is this power that has imposed itself on our lives, and it is the money power. And in 1936, C.H. Douglas gave a brief historical survey of the money question, and he went back in history and explained that the beasts of various kind were the chief forms of wealth, and the cattle, of course, the cattle had to be fed, and very often the rich man, the cattle owner, didn't have the sufficient corn and fodder, so had to buy in extra. He had quite large herds of cattle, the rich one, and the merchant of grain and fodder, usually an itinerant, found the inconvenience to take away the cattle from the cattle owner. It didn't suit him, and in which case the cattle owner would issue a leather disc which represented one head of cattle. It was the fodder merchant's claim to that one head of cattle. Think about that. It was now the fodder merchant's claim to that head of cattle. The money had been issued, or the disc had been issued by the owner of the cattle. And that's a very important point in history. Now, the Latin word for cattle is pecus, and the modern word pecuniary is derived from pecus and is historical proof of the derivation of the first money. And what happened is that in that simple arrangement, there is one point of immense importance to be noted, and don't forget it. The owner of the real wealth, the owner of the cattle, actually, literally, in truth, made not metaphorically, but he made the money representing his wealth. That is so important to understand, and to understand why social credit emphasizes it.
Thank you,
The,
Betty. Thank you, Betty, for that. I'm just going to cut across to Wally and let Wally have his opening salvos. Wally.
Well, it's all very interesting. There have been many types of money. In this case, you're referring to cattle, and that is the basic word from which we derive the name pecuniary, or the word pecuniary, meaning pertaining to monetary things. Money is a claim check. It's a promise to pay. The grower or the producer of the cattle needed certain things from other people, and so he made a symbol of his cattle or one of his cattle by a disc. And the person who received the disc could come back to the producer of the cattle and claim the cow. It's just a claim check. Money is a means of making a claim. And so that is the way that that particular manifestation of money developed. And the thing of it is, we have to think, as you said, Betty, from the beginning. If we were just beings living without any form of representation and just used physical things, the situation would be quite obvious. But it's very, very cumbersome to do that. It's impossible to do that. And in the modern world, it would be completely impossible because we have a very complex exchange of goods and services that expand over large geographical areas. And so we need a representational system. But when you start to make a system that is superimposed over the actual relationships that we have, it is easy to fall into error. It's very easy to have a system developed that is subject to not just an exchange of goods, but those who control the issue of those tokens, if you want, also develop or derive a lot of power from their ability to do that. And that's what's happened in our modern economy, because the ability to create money resides totally with the banking system. And the whole system is backed up legally on the credits that are transferred from one bank account to another. So we have gotten into a situation where the banks, being the sole creators of money, not the producers of money, of goods, as you mentioned, they have a tremendous amount of power, because you can only produce or consume on the basis of the tickets of claim that you have. And if the claims are all produced by one source, then obviously an enormous amount of power goes into that one source, which for us is the banking system, which is national or international. It's all tied in. And so in that sense, we've really gone astray, because, and again, of course, there's another complication, and that is where social credit really comes in, and that is the replacement of human labor by non-labor factors of production. In other words, technology. That is something that didn't exist in the very primitive economy. People produced with their hands, and they simply exchanged goods and services. And as we've seen, they developed a representational system, or a money system, to facilitate that exchange. In the modern economy, we have a very significant new factor that has occurred, and that is the problem of distribution. Social credit is concerned with distribution, not exchange. There are many attempts to provide local exchange systems, but that's what they are, exchange systems. They are not distributive systems. And we are concerned. Douglas was an engineer, and he saw the tremendous potential in modern technology for production, and he realized how it was already replacing labor, and how in the future it would probably be a major factor in replacing labor. And
Okay.
so
I'm go-
we need a system of distribution, not just exchange.
okay, and that's a very important point, Wally. I'm just going to cut across you here and bring up an article where it shows that this was a means of exchange, not distribution. And that is in these island economies where they actually placed rocks around, and these rocks depicted money. They depicted a means of exchange between communities, these island communities. And I think that that's most important, that we recognise there is a clear distinction between exchange and distribution. And social credit is talking about distribution. Betty Lukes.
Mm. Well, Arnie, I think that Jesus showed us the importance of the distribution in the loaves and fishes, just as one example, and how the people were um, distributed the loaves and fishes, and there was more than enough for people. There was more than enough. There were baskets of fishes and loaves left over. To me, Jesus was showing that there is this abundance. And in the 1970s, Jeremy Lee did a study of just the potential of Australia, and I'm talking about the physical production of Australia and its resources, its amazing resources, and he added them all up, and then he or listed them, and then he divided the amount by the number of citizens, probably by families. I can assure you, a family could not have consumed all that Australia had available there for us. But because of the money system and how it functions, then it is not distributed.
Mm.
And that's what to me, these are questions we have to ask. And those folk who are interested in the figures, which I have to admit I'm not so interested in the figures of such, but I am interested in the physical, and to understand the importance of the physical. We can't talk about a nation's wealth. Um, it's we're actually talking about a nation's well-being, but it has to be, it is shown when it is consumed, and until it's consumed, where is the well-being?
Thank you for that, Betty. I'm just going to cut across to our ALOR library and highlight to our viewers that Jeremy Lee's books here in our library, there's been a significant amount of effort to place them onto the website, and they're available for you to consider and download. You can also, of course, get copies of the books. I think they're still in print. Wally Klinck.
Yes, if you do an estimate of the financial income of the consumers in society, and you do an estimate of the actual physical output, you will find that the physical output, including capital and so on, is much greater, much greater than the financial income or the ability of the consumers to claim the wealth that is being produced. And of course, we fill that gap with debt, which is immediately an ability to claim, but unfortunately it puts a mortgage on the future. So it doesn't really liquidate the costs that have been made in that production. It allows them to be liquidated on the spot as the producer gets the money, but now there's a charge against the future that embodies those costs. And so it doesn't really cancel them, it transfers them as a charge against the future. And we all know that when you do something physical and it's finished, physical costs, at least we should know that the physical costs, the inputs, have already been provided. There's no residual of work that has to be done when you've already finished a given project. It's done. You may go on to do another project. So we shouldn't have, in our economy, we shouldn't have obligations that go beyond what we've physically done. And it's a question, when you talk about the physical wealth that we produce for consumers, we have to remember too that much of that You see, the individual actually, to sustain himself, to sustain life, doesn't really require a great deal. It's rather limited, really. But then we have many, many more complex needs, wants, desires, and pleasures that we've developed, invented, and discovered, and so that our economy is much more complex than that. But the thing of it is, we are forced to produce things which we would not otherwise choose to produce, merely to get the incomes that are required, not to buy the goods that we're producing now when they come out, but to buy goods that were produced in the past. And that is why we have been thrown into a situation where we have a grossly distorted economy, where in the United States, for instance, approximately 50% of the economy is devoted to war or war-related production or services, which really benefits no one. There is a case to be made that you should defend your country, but I mean, it goes so far, far beyond that today. We have a situation, and as we said, in Yemen, there's a war going on there. The U.S. armaments manufacturers are supplying that. What for? People are being destroyed. It's not creating a civilization, it's destroying a civilization. But it makes a lot of money for a lot of people in heavy industry, and it makes a lot of money for the ordinary people who work in those industries. And that's why you don't find too many people really being vociferous about their objections to that type of activity, because they depend on it for their living. They're not going to eat the bombs, they're not going to eat the shells and the missiles, but they are going to use the money they earn to eat the bread that was produced in the past.
Thank you.
And that's what I say, when you design a representational system, something that represents reality, you can fall into the gravest of error. And that is exactly what we have done.
Thank you, Wally. I'm just going to cut across to our world debt clock here. And the fact is that it continues. I've only been on there for nearly 4 minutes, and it continues to increase in debt. There's no such thing as us clearing our debt. We are continuing to increase in debt. And the fact is, if we weren't borrowing, and our governments weren't borrowing, then the economy would fall flat on its face immediately, because the whole economy in the current regime relies on debt in order for it to function. We actually have to mortgage tomorrow in order to buy what's already been produced, and you've got to get your head around that. That's not easy to make it quite clear. Betty Lukes.
Arnie, that's right. It's not clear. And in my years, I found it very difficult for people to understand that. And I was thinking of it this morning. I'm thinking, now, what can I use as an example? How can I demonstrate to the people that the increase is in the real world, not in the money as such? And not that, well, what we could do is say, encourage, our viewer to take one of their dollar notes, whether it's $100 or $50 or $10, take it. And if it really does increase, put it into the garden, water it, and have a look at it a week later or 2 weeks later and see how much growth there has been. And of course it's not, because it's a different system to the world that we live in, the real world. It is a man-made system, and it's based on debt. It was based on fraud 5,000 years ago, and it is still based on fraud. And that's something that people don't understand. Douglas said in the 1936 Money and Historical Survey, one long unbroken history of fraud and the acquisition of this power of money creation by the banks is the final chapter. It has been going on for at least 5,000 years. I was looking at that book, The Babylonian Woe, yesterday, and came across, I think it's Hammurabi's Law, number 9. And in it he's saying that if there are people who claim that they have gold and issue receipts on their gold, which is the form that money first took in this fraud, then would be severe penalties. And of course this goes, if we want to have a look at it in the modern world, then you only have to go back to 1694, and in collusion with the government of the day, that's for sure, the Bank of England, the private bank, was given the authority to create credit, to create money, a form of money, out of nothing, claim it as their own, and charge interest on it. And it is we, the people, who have to repay it. And nothing has changed there. So, all right, if you think I'm not right, if you think that money, which really you're worshipping an idol in that sense, if you think that money is going to increase, you do what I said. Bury it, water it, go back a week later and see whether any growth has occurred.
Thank you for that, Betty. That's very important. I'm going to cut across to our website and just show you the resources that are there. Bank of England reports, money creation in the modern economy, it's all there, working papers. And I'll also remind viewers of our sister website, thecrossroads.org, and down the bottom of page 1, money creation in the modern economy, we've actually embedded the video from the Bank of England there. And notice in the background the gold. They couldn't do the video in an office. They had to actually depict and say, well, all their money is backed on gold, which of course it's not, because that gold comes and that gold goes, and whether it's in that room or it's not in that room, it won't make any difference to the economy. So even in that sense, subliminally, they're attempting to infer that gold, which it's not backed, the money is not backed by gold, is in the closet, when in actual fact it's not there at all. Wally.
I think that it might be instructive to notice that, or to note that one of the directors of the Bank of England, Sir Josiah Stamp, I think made the comment that he did not believe it was good for people to be prosperous. It was damaging to their character. Well, if that's the case, then that's a very sad commentary on the human story, and it doesn't bode well for the future.
Yeah.
It's a very overbearing, arrogant, and assuming attitude toward human beings. It's certainly absolutely directly opposed to the Christian message.
Thank you, Wally. That's exactly right. The message that man was presenting is one of Puritanism, and that is that you've got to pursue good based on what they see, no matter what. And how dare they assume the mantle of wisdom on humanity? That's madness. Betty.
Well, I still think that it comes back to people understanding how the real world works. And I'm thinking of the parents and grandparents, and thinking about their children's and their grandchildren's future, because it's not just what they're doing now. It's the robotic revolution that is bearing down upon us. And so it's not only that there are the people who can't gain access to that production because they don't have a job, but you're going to have much more than that. And from what I can see, they're trialing what they're going to do about it by what's happening in China with the social credit disservice.
That's exactly right. Thank you for that, Betty. That's a very good summary of where we're heading. It's one of Puritanism or communism, same thing. It's that's the direction, that the state will be all pervasive. It will monitor you. It'll assess you, and it'll deem whether you're credit worthy or no. And that, of course, is the antithesis of Christianity, where Christianity teaches you that there's a spark of divinity. A spark of divinity. You could actually be, in a sense, just that creative spirit. Now, I'm just going to present us back to the crossroads.org, and there's this excellent article there by Reverend G.R. Robertson, Fundamentals of Douglas Social Credit in the Teaching of Jesus. And I would encourage all our listeners, all our viewers, go to the Crossroads. There's a wealth of resources there that help reinforce this understanding, so that you can look at it, you look at the scriptures, you compare it, and you realize, of course, let those that wool, that plaque that's across your eyes, the veil, let it be removed. Wally Klinck.
The veil, that's right, Arnie. It is a veil, and it's very, very insidious. If you have complete abundance and everyone has everything they need, people are probably going to get along in a fairly harmonious way. But if you want to control people, and you can get control of the actual wealth that exists so that other people cannot access it without your permission, then you have achieved for yourself an enormous control over the affairs of mankind, a control that is completely beyond anything that is justifiable. And so that if you can make money scarce relative to the actual goods that are available, and everybody is scrambling for money, they become obsessed with money, and money becomes, it's almost an idolatrous situation where people become obsessed with money, and they lose sight of what Betty would say is the real world, because the real world is one of abundance. But if the amount of money reflecting it is much less, then people think that there's a scarcity. And that leads to the further development of them blaming the scarcity on, well, we all know who, their neighbor. Other people are too lazy. You see, he who is without sin, let him cast the first stone. I mean, it's such an insidious thing because it puts everyone at war with everyone else. Every individual, every community, every state, every province, every nation. And that's what's going on in the world right now, this dreadful situation that we see in the Middle East. It's all a result of this scarcity of money and the struggle to make up for it, and the fallacy, or the foolishness of trying to make up with an obligation against the future, in other words, debt. It's so unreal. And Betty, you were right. We have got a system of representing reality that is not only misrepresents it, but increasingly, proportionately misrepresents it. And it is going to be the end of civilization if we do not solve this problem.
Thank you, Wally. That's an excellent summary. We're getting close to the half-hour mark, and I'll just remind our viewers before I do one last lap that on the ALOR website, you'll see in the middle of the navigation New Times Survey on page 5, and it presents there on page 5 the New Times Survey, Douglas Social Credit, the Policy of Freedom. Very important document to have a look at and get your mind around, and you realise that there is such a thing as a policy of freedom, because Marx's 200-year birth, his 10 steps to communise the world. I mean, it's right there in front of you. You can read it. You can search and find it in a heartbeat. But is there a policy of freedom, an antithesis to world domination, world hegemony of these what is really central bankers? Final comments, please, Betty Lukes.
Well, that's the point, Arnie. It's the very opposite of what they're pushing us into, and freedom is not a free-for-all, and it's not a freedom. It's not a license to do whatever you want. There are natural laws that you have to adhere to. Otherwise, you have the chaos that you see around you now, and I can only hope and pray that people will take up their responsibility, and you will find it very worthwhile.
Thank you for that beautiful summary. And Wally Klinck, closing comments, please.
Well, I think our challenge is to do something about it. We can talk about it till the end of time, but something has to be done. And we have to devise means of getting information out to the people so that they understand the tremendous veil that has been placed over their eyes and the misrepresentation that has taken place and the consequences of that misrepresentation and the way it's led to the concentration of power and wealth. And we have to understand that placing power in one center in the world to govern the policies of the world is not realistic. In fact, it's in terrible danger because creativity comes from individuals. It does not come from some all-knowing small body of people. And life in general, if it's going to effervesce and be meaningful and rich and beautiful for humans, it has to be separate. It has to be very, very widely available, dispersed. It can't be concentrated. That's tyranny.
Thank you, Wally. Beautiful summary. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll just remind you that the Crossroads, all of the videos that we produce will be placed onto the Crossroads website, and they're also at our YouTube channel. The members, the forum members, do a quite a large amount of work in order to prepare themselves to present compelling arguments for why freedom. Why is freedom? Why is it more important than slavery? Is that such a hard question? And of course, the foundation of freedom is the Christian faith. Arnie Luke's. Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me?